There are some students that are going to be walking in late, so we apologize. It just has to do with the class schedule. But we are ready to begin. So I'll start off by introducing our panelists. Each panelist will then speak for approximately 15 minutes, and at the end of the session there will be about 20 minutes or so for questions where people will be able to go to the microphones on the floor. So our four panelists this afternoon, we have Viken Attarian. He's here for the Armenian community, and he's the former chairman of the Armenian General Benevolent Union. Professor Roman Serbyn from the Ukrainian community. He is Professor Emeritus of Russian and East European History at the Université du Québec à Montréal. Mr. Moses Gashirabake from Rwanda. He is with Fasken, Martineau, DuMoulin, a law firm, and Dafina Savic with the Roma Sinti, the Human Rights Coordinator from the Montreal Holocaust Memorial Center and Director of Romanipe. So to begin, I would like you to welcome Mr. Viken Attarian, and he will be starting his presentation now.
Thank you. It obviously on the slide it says that it is the first documented genocide of the 20th century, and I underlined documented because the first genocide of the 20th century is the genocide of the Herero by the German occupation forces in Namibia. However, from a scientific perspective and academic studies perspective, the genocide of Armenians does remain one of the most widely studied and documented at the time as it was occurring. So that's why it is known as the first genocide of the 20th century. I want to iterate some general facts about our community in Canada. It is over 100 years old, and it is one of the oldest ethnocultural communities in Canada. It is heavily institutionalized with numerous churches, day schools, Sunday schools, community centers, charitable organizations, student associations, professional associations, all the things that go with a well-organized community. Our community has all of those structures. Around 60,000 Canadians identified themselves of Armenian origin. About half of them live in Montreal, and the other half live in Toronto and its suburbs. When I mean Montreal, I mean Laval and the South Shore and the West Island, the greater metropolitan area. The rest are dispersed. Around 5,000 Armenians are dispersed in Ottawa, Vancouver, and Calgary as major centers. And then there are some smaller minor communities in Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Halifax, and so on. The community has multiple geographic origins, and it has grown through several immigration waves into Canada. The first ones are from Greece and Turkey. Obviously, the more ancient ones was right post-genocide, but I'm talking larger immigration waves. Then in Egypt and Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Armenia itself after post-Soviet period. And the latest subgroup, which came over about 2 years ago, is a large subgroup of refugees who came from Syria. What are the preoccupations of the community? The community is concerned very much with the preservation of identity, with the preservation of the memory of the genocide, a struggle for the recognition of the genocide, not only in Canada, but in various across the world, but also in Canada as well. There are some still ground to be covered. And of course, the physical security and the future of the Republic of Armenia, where many Armenians live. And all of these are related. If you say, well, how come they're only preoccupied with these things? These are the major preoccupations. They're not the only preoccupations, but these are the major preoccupations community-wide. All of these are related to the fact of the denial of the perpetrator state and its successor state, which is the Republic of Turkey today, of the committed crime. And therefore, there is this major preoccupation. And here I want to go back to the theme of this conference. It's justice and accountability. But there are several minor steps before we reach there. And this is sort of a roadmap as how do we get where we want to be. So acknowledgement leading to recognition, recognition leading to accountability, accountability leading to reparations, reparations leading to justice, justice leading to reconciliation, and reconciliation leading to peace. So it's very important when we talk about how come there cannot be any peace, how come you cannot get together with your counterparts and discuss these things. Well, because Armenians for over a century, we're almost permanently stuck in step number 1. So we cannot be talking about justice and peace, which are later in the roadmap. Peace can only come with justice, and justice can only come with accountability and reparations. In my bio, I said that I'm a third-generation victim of the genocide. What does it actually mean? What does it mean from a daily context for me as a person standing in front of you? Well, it means that my maternal tongue, which is the Western Armenian, which is one of the 2 main branches of the Armenian language, it is now listed as an endangered language by UNESCO. And the likelihood of its survival beyond 1 more generation is very slim. This is what it actually means. It also means that the historical, cultural, and ancestral heritage of my people was abruptly cut in 1915 and is likely lost forever. It means that the over 40 linguistic regional dialects and the rich ethnographic heritage of Armenian presence living in their homeland for millennia has disappeared forever from the global heritage of humanity. This is what it means. I'm not even talking about the material losses, you know, the land and the wealth that Armenians were I'm not talking about that. I'm talking at a very high level. What does it actually mean for humanity, and what does it actually mean in my daily life? What is the impact of this denial on Canada in general? Well, you saw that there's a heavily institutionalized community, heavily organized, but there is an opportunity cost, meaning that by the fact that the major preoccupation is one thing, it means that the community cannot occupy itself with other things which also merit its attention. The opportunity cost of the energy and resources of the community, because it focuses on recognitions, that is lost in terms of things that could be done for the rest of the country. The ongoing identity of the community is defined by its victimhood in genocide. So people immediately think about Armenians saying, oh, okay, they are the victims of the genocide. Yes, but Armenians are much more than that. And we want to be seen as being much more than that. And we want to identify ourselves as being much more than that. The intergenerational transmission of trauma and feeling of justice denied. This is a huge burden that it crosses generational boundaries. That is why I am a third-generation victim of the genocide. My children, who are now adults, are the 4th-generation victims of the genocide. And it renders inter-community outreach very difficult, especially because even in Canada today, the Turkish state continues to use its state resources to fight the recognition. And I want to bring this context a little bit further. Again, from the perspective of me as a person, if I want to visit the graves of the people from the genocide 1915 onwards, meaning survivors or people who died there, and then they were strewn all across the world as a result of the genocide, if I want to visit their graves to pay my respects, these are the countries that I have to go to. Turkey, Armenia, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Cyprus, Egypt, Greece, Italy, France, England, Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Thailand, Australia, Cuba, USA, Canada, and Argentina. 6 continents and 20 countries. And I'm talking about the ability to pay respects to my ancestors. Many people who are immigrants, they may have to go back maybe to one country. Or people in Quebec, they may have to go to their remote villages and lands, and maybe they may have to go back to France. But by doing that, they may go back 300-400 years. I'm talking only about the last century. This is what I am obliged to do, and this if I find those graves. And in those locations, in each of them, there are at least 2-3 locations in each of those countries. And there are at least 3 known locations where there are mass graves of the genocide victims that include the remains of my ancestors. And the history of my family prior to the genocide is practically erased. It's very difficult to find anything. And mine is not a unique case. It is, in fact, the norm among my generation of descendants of the genocide. Just last week, I had an email from a total unknown person in Florida. And she was looking for her own roots. And the only thing in common is my last name with hers. And she was wondering whether I am related to her because her father and her grandfather told her stories where she came from. Unfortunately, by digging a little bit further, I could not help her out because there are no relations. My last name, it was just a commonality of last name. But this is an illustration of things that happen over 100 years after, where people are still looking for who they are, where do they come from, and the answers are not there. This is the daily result of the genocide. Well, being the first, and it's in quotation marks for obvious reasons, as I told you, being the first genocide of the 20th century means the first to lose the living memory of the survivors. This is a very important fact. And losing the emotional power of their presence. The person you're looking at is Kanar Yemenigian. She is the last Canadian survivor of the genocide who passed away a couple of months ago at an age of 108. 2 years ago, we walked together, she in her wheelchair, in the March of 10,000, marking the 100th anniversary in downtown Montreal. A remarkable woman. But by losing all the people who are the actual survivors who were there, we lose their presence. And this is a huge, huge void. Being the first also means the opportunity to dig further into the eyewitness accounts to acquire historical precision and validation, because now all the survivors are gone. It means suddenly realizing that maybe we should have recorded these things and that things as well, but we can no longer do that anymore. It means realizing that we should have preserved these other things, we should have done these other projects, but for a variety of reasons we could not do them. Now those opportunities are also gone. It also means being the first to realize that there is a duty to tell other victims of other genocides that what we are going through and what we have missed is coming to them as well, because obviously all the survivors will eventually pass away of all genocides. And our experience through which we are going right now will be their future as a community. And therefore, there is a duty and obligation for us as a community, as humans, to ensure that others learn from our mistakes and to assist them to ensure the long-term preservation of their memory and their historical records. It also means that as long as there is no acknowledgement by the perpetrator state, then the burden for struggle for justice and peace is now, you suddenly realize, even though you were in that struggle, now there are no longer the physical presence of the other people who've been there as a bulwark backing you, as living witnesses of what happened. So in general for our community, it means that because of the lack of acknowledgement and perpetuation of denial, there is a perpetuation of victimhood. And as I said, the fourth post-genocide generation of Armenians is now in adulthood, and they are the fourth generation of genocide victims. And the fifth post-genocide generation is now being born. And my hope is that they don't become victims. Now I'd like to read you a poem which I wrote a couple of years ago as a result of me witnessing what happened with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And it was a rather long poem, and for this occasion I decided to put it in a different way, and its power emerged. I'm going to read it to you. It puts into context three concepts, but especially as to what happens to children. The poem actually can be read excuse me. The poem should be read this way, up and down in three parts. But the reason I put it this way, you can actually read it horizontally as well. So I'm going to read it the way it's supposed to be, but I urge you to look at it in a different fashion. And it sort of shows, it goes further down. It's the descent into darkness of humanity. The Ottoman State Orphanage is a place of darkness where the killers of my parents changed me into one of them, where they beat me for speaking Armenian, where they starved me for praying in Armenian, where they torture me for singing in Armenian, where they murder me for refusing to change my name. Prove to me that you are human. Give me back my name. The Lodz ghetto is a place of darkness, where the murderers of my people never have enough, where they enslave me for their factories, where they force me to wear the yellow sign. Give me your children, they tell my parents. We need to feed the death machines, they tell my parents. Otherwise, it will have to be you, they tell my parents. You are just tattooed numbers, they tell us. Prove to me that you are human. Give me back my name. The school where we also reside is a place of darkness, where the cheaters of my parents have stolen us from them. After taking our lands and cultures, they took away the most precious, the children, who spoke and sang and laughed and played. Here they beat me for speaking Mohawk. Here they starve me for singing in Cree. Here they torture me for being Dene, or for not being one of them. They rape, kill, and bury me to hide their own shame. Prove to me that you are human. Give me back my name. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now for our second presentation. I also realized that I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. I am not Sue Montgomery, the way it says on the, my name is Alina Peru. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Business, and Social Sciences here at Vanier. Okay, so our second presentation from Professor Roman Serbyn.
Ladies and gentlemen, the advantage of speaking second is that very often you can ride on the coattails of the previous speaker. Much of what he said about the Armenian case applies to the Ukrainian genocide, the question of preserving the memory, the question of fighting against denial. This is common to a lot of genocides. Now, genocides have much in common, otherwise we could not speak about genocides in plural, but they also have many singular, unique features. And what I would like to show is some of the unique features that are in the Ukrainian genocide. Now, if I can just get a hold of this proper. Holodomor, as you know, is the term we'll see, come to it later. Holodomor, Stalin's multifaceted faceted genocide. What was the genocide against the Ukrainians that we now call Holodomor? To answer the question, we must keep in mind the historical context in which it happened. It was a time when Stalin decided to prepare the Soviet state to continue its vocation to impose its version of socialism on the world. Kremlin's imperialist ambition was well depicted in the Soviet emblem by the hammer and sickle over the globe. You notice that you have, I don't think I have the right know-how. Anyway, you'll notice that the hammer and sickle is over the whole globe. Ukraine at that time, or most of Ukraine at that time, was part of the Soviet Union. This is 1930s. And of course, Stalin needed the Ukrainian population to work on this conquest for socialism of the whole world. I could do no better in presenting this brief note on the Ukrainian catastrophe than to begin with the seminal analysis by Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish legal scholar, who conceptualized the age-old crime, gave it its name, and prevailed upon the delegates of the United Nations General Assembly to adopt the Anti-Genocide Convention. Lemkin was well familiar with the Russian imperialist history in both the Tsarist and Soviet epochs. As he stated to the commemorative audience in New York, and here we have his words, this was a gathering to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the famine, as it was called at that time, 1953, and this is what Lemkin said. What I want to speak about is perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. Lemkin conceptualized the genocide as a four-pronged attack on the Ukrainian people, on the Ukrainians or the Ukrainian nation. Notice the first was the destruction of the intelligentsia, which he called in his text the national brain. The second, he said, well, if you destroy the brain, the whole body collapses. The second was the church, the Ukrainian autocephalous or Ukrainian independent church, which had separated from the Russian Orthodox Church. And the third, and this is a very important point, independent farmers, these are his words, the repository of the tradition, folklore, the national language, the national spirit. This is the important thing. You notice that he defines the peasants here as an ethnic group, not a social or economic group. It was for this reason, as an national ethnic group, that the peasants were part of this genocide. And it said the weapon used, most terrible of all, starvation. And the fourth point was, well, in place of those who were perished or those who were exiled from Ukraine and so forth, others, Soviet citizens, would be brought from Russia or other republics. Now, Lemkin's analysis is borne out or corroborated by the documents that we have now, both from Western sources, from diplomatic dispatches, but what is much more important, from the Soviet documents, the Soviet state and party. After all, it was the party that was ruling the state and not the other way around. And these documents are very explicit. They, and to go over it very briefly, the destruction of the intelligentsia, or the destruction of the elites in the cities, the intelligentsia was primarily in the cities, began with the arrest of over 700 members, or so-called members, of a fictitious organization, an organization that was invented by the GPU, the police of that time, and which was labeled the Union for the Independence of Ukraine. Now, they put as the head of this organization an academician, and then they had other professors and so on, and going all the way down to village priests and some of the so-called kulaks. That was the first. The second was the liquidation of the Ukrainian Orthodox, independent Ukrainian autocephalous church, which was nationally conscious and which was helping revive the Ukrainian nation. This was done in 1929, 1930. 1929, 1930 were the arrests. The trial was in 1930, and the liquidation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was 1930 as well. And the third was the liquidation of the kulaks by the policy of so-called dekulakization. The kulaks were the more prosperous, more enterprising peasants who, in fact, were the elite of the countryside. Now, the countryside, the Ukrainian countryside, was about 3/4 of the population of Ukraine. So their role was very important, and they had to be liquidated. The kulaks were grouped into 3 categories. The first category was simply shot. The second category was exiled to Russia, Siberia, or Kazakhstan, or somewhere else. And the third category was driven out of the village and dumped literally in the winter in the snow and outside the village. They were not allowed to join the collectives that were being organized. The reason for this was to deprive the Ukrainian nation of its leadership, the leadership that was provided, that could have been provided by the groups here mentioned. As a result, you have the Great Famine, and the reason for that, the famine, or should I say, phrase it differently. This led to the Great Famine because there were revolts against this collectivization. There were peaceful revolts, in other words, simply demonstration, but there were also some violent revolts, in other words, assassinations of the GPU people and so on. Now, to quash these, the army was sent in with military destruction of some of these revolts, and finally, in 1932-33, you have the Great Famine. So the famine was not the result of collectivization, as is very often presented. No, collectivization simply meant that all the harvest was put together. The famine was the result of the seizure of that harvest that was put together in the collectives. It was much easier to take it from the village when everything was brought together than it would be to go from farm to farm and seize from the individuals. So why was it seized? It was seized, it was locked in storage, as you can see here on the left. It was exported, and as a result, you have the famine. This famine was secret. In other words, it was not recognized, not like the first famine, 1921-23, when it was recognized and Western aid came, and especially in Ukraine, the aid came from the Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, which some of you may know. In the 1930s, there were no photographs of famine that could be taken legally or openly. That's why we only have a few photographs, which I call stolen photographs. These were photographs, like you see on the bottom there. You have a person, a couple of people lying. Were taken usually by foreigners who happened to be there and took these photographs. That's why there are not many of them. Lemkin conceptualized the Ukrainian genocide within the framework of the United Nations, or within the parameters of the United Nations Convention, which speaks about a genocide being against a group, and there are 4 groups that are mentioned: national, ethnic, racial, and religious. You notice that there is no social and economic. So Lemkin presented, as I told you, the peasants as an ethnic group, because that was really what it was all about. So I think this is basically about the famine, since we're supposed to cover also say a few words about the community. I'll end here if there are any questions. Also, should I point out that if you're interested, you can read Lemkin's short piece on the Ukrainian genocide. I published it in 28 languages, so you can choose your language. And Also, my article on the Ukrainian genocide was published in the proceedings of a conference in Poland several years ago. If anybody's interested, I can give you the reference. You can find it on the internet. Now, concerning the Ukrainian community, well, the Ukrainian community is one of the older communities in Canada. We commemorate 125th anniversary of first settlers in Canada. Most of the history was good history, although we have had some very unpleasant moments, and one of these unpleasant moments was the internment during the First World War. The irony was that the Ukrainians, there was no Ukrainian state fighting against the British Empire in Canada. Ukrainians were part of other empires which did not particularly treat the Ukrainian population very favorably. Anyway, this is in the background. Most of the history after that was pretty decent for Ukrainians. And I must say that during the First World War, while some Ukrainians were sitting in concentration camps, other Ukrainians were fighting for Canada and for the empire, the British Empire, I mean. What's happened here? Oh. Anybody help? It's not moving. Okay. This is just to show you that we're a pretty well integrated community in Canada. We have Ukrainians in all fields of Canadian public life, in political, in the arts, in the sciences, and so on. Here you have RAMON first Ukrainian, or first Governor General of Ukrainian background. How did you do it? Oh, no. Okay, oh, it's on this side. Okay, now we were supposed to have Christia Freeland this morning. Well, you have her now, so I don't have to talk about her. You know, Ukrainians are very proud of her. We think that she will do a good job, and this is one example of the integration of ethnic groups in Canadian. We have most of the problems that ethnic groups in Canada have are actually problems that are brought from the old country. And this is one example of the problems from the old country. This is when Ukraine, that we have seen, was a part of the Soviet Empire, the genocide, and we have not been able to establish good contacts with the Russian community, which unfortunately, or a good part of it, is still supporting Putin's imperialism in Ukraine and celebrating this kind of commemoration. Here is the 70th anniversary of the Great Victory, which for Ukrainians, the Great Victory was also the victory or the subjugation of all of Ukraine under communism. So to us, to Ukrainians, hammer and sickle is the same as the swastika is to the Jewish community. This is not acceptable. And when they announce again that this year they're going to have this, well, the Ukrainian community has trouble going along with this. So I don't know when the reconciliation with the Russian community in Canada will come along, but this is something that, of course, we have to work on. Our relations are much better with the Jewish community. Of course, historically, there were problems between the Ukrainians and Jews, especially since Ukrainians and Jews were subjugated to the, well, in the West, first to the Polish state, and in the East to the Tsars, and then the Soviet Russian state. However, in Canada, we have established very good relations. I think we're progressing in that. Here you have the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. This is an organization that was sponsored and financed by Jimmy TEMERTY, a businessman in Toronto, and which is doing a fantastic job both in Canada and in Ukraine. In Ukraine, they organized last year the commemoration of BABYN. I don't think I have to explain what BABYN means to the Jewish community. This is where over 30,000 Jews were massacred by the invading Nazi German forces in the beginning of the World War II. In Montreal, we also have a very nice group of Ukrainian Jewish dialogue, and I'm sure that you can recognize the gentleman fourth from the left, Dr. Goldblum, who was one of the founders of this organization. We had two very interesting dues at the, or events at the Jewish Library. And we're having the next one, and I think you can recognize somebody here as well. So you're all invited to come to this commemorative here. This is in honor of Dr. Goldblum, and we are very proud to have the Honorable Urban Kotler as our guest speaker, who will be speaking on Ukrainian-Jewish relations, Ukraine today, and human rights issues in the region. I think this shows that communities working together can achieve great success for themselves and for Canada. Thank you very much for your attention.
Our third presentation, Moses Gashirabake.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to the previous speakers and to the organizers of the event and to everyone present. Just for the benefit of those who just came in a few minutes ago, I saw some students walking in. I am a 1994 genocide against the Tutsi survivor in Rwanda, and I'll speak a little bit about my personal experience in those terms, and then I'll talk about my moving to Canada, so the experience of the Rwandan community in Canada, and then I'll talk about what maybe Canada can do to solve some of the challenges that I've seen within my community. So in 1994, when the genocide happened in Rwanda, I was very young. I was below the age of 10. I was about 5 years old. And at that time, you're young, and that's when you begin being conscious about yourself. Of course, I did not know much about what was going on, but in the larger political context, or the Rwandan social fabric, these are actually problems that emanated from colonialism. So as you all know, most African nations, close to all of them, were colonized by different powers in the 1800s. And that particular factor contributed to conflicts and whatnot. But then looking at it, the problem in Rwanda escalated in the sense of, I would say, there was that colonial past, but there was also the post-independence Rwanda, whereby economic disparities played into that. And as I was growing up, trying to understand what career that I wanted to partake and what contributions that I wanted to give back to the world, the fact that I ended up in Canada got me thinking, what would be the best way to promote peace and cohesion in a place where you have the colonial past that mixed up with the economic disparities leading to people killing one another. And of course, the Holocaust in Europe and Rwanda shared that perspective in terms of the actual economic sense, whereby one community feels threatened by the other from an economic sense, and then escalating into violence. And I've seen that in African nations and in African countries, the fact that you do have people living in poverty and not being able to put something on the table gives impetus to violence and conflict. So in the last 20 years in Rwanda, the opposite has been happening, whereby economic growth is actually changing things, and now Rwandans are seeing themselves as Rwandans as opposed to identifying as Hutu or Tutsi or Twa. And that got me thinking. I grew up in Kenya, so from 1994 until the age of 20, I grew up in Kenya as a stateless refugee. And even though Kenya has never escalated into a genocide or violence, I think the previous speaker spoke about the post-electoral violence in Kenya. Even though most of it is attributed to ethnic differences, most of it is actually connected to economics. And in the last couple of years, when I was studying political science and then eventually being lucky to study law at McGill, I've been looking at ways that I could involve in my community to raise the economic opportunities for people. And of course, you do that through increasing access to schooling, access to social services, and eventually moving out of poverty to look at oneself as an equal person within the community. So that's one of the things that I've been looking at, and I think that economic development, in my view, there's a lot of research going on in many places in Harvard and other places, that economic development could be a mitigator, not something that eliminates conflicts 100%, but it could be one ways to eliminate conflicts. So, of course, speaking for 10 minutes would not be enough time to go through the challenges that my community is facing back home or in Canada. But speaking from a personal experience, I came to Canada at the age of 20 after having lived in Kenya for 13 years as a stateless person. And I remember I could not speak about the fact that I was a survivor of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda until I came to Canada. So one of the challenges in my community is the psychological stigma. The stigma not to be able to come out and share with others. And I remember when I was at Concordia about 6 years ago, one of my professors in international human rights in political science encouraged me to speak about my own experience. And in the last close to 6.5 years, that experience has actually helped me to move from feeling as if I'm a victim to feeling as if I actually have the responsibility to share my experience in order to stop the occurrence of a genocide again. And I'm actually really, really happy that one of those professors that taught me in political science, even though it was in a different class in peace and conflict studies, Professor Ara Karabogosian came here. He currently teaches at Vani, and I was extremely touched to see him here tonight. Thank you so much. Yeah. So the second challenge that my community faces is the socio-economic challenge within Canada. So someone comes from Rwanda, they are a genocide survivor, they have the psychological baggage, and they're not able to have access to economic opportunities. And sometimes economic opportunities are connected to the educational opportunities that you have. So as you all know, in order for someone or any society to succeed, there has to be the social success, there has to be some economic success, and there has to be some political success. But then you can never access economic success if you haven't had social success to access education, and it's almost impossible to have access to political success if you don't have the two. So one of the challenges, and I want to also thank the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, of which Professor Orin Kotler and my friend Brandon have been working very hard for the last 1 year to set up. In 2014, Professor Kotler invited me to speak in front of the International Committee on Human Rights at Parliament, and they were asking me to speak about the issue of children that were born out of rape in 1994 in Rwanda, who some of them are actually part of the Canadian society. And I told them, that is a challenge, that is the psychological challenge. But we also have less access to education and academic opportunities. But then that's connected to the fact that when somebody comes here, their primordial objective is to survive, is to heal, is to look for a job, not to go to school and you probably don't have enough to put on your table. So in terms of solutions, I think for the psychological aspect of the problem, somebody who've lived here in Canada for the last almost 7.5 years, and having been a Canadian citizen for the last 2 years, I think one of the things that Canada can do is to become direct, as I testified before the Committee on International Human Rights, a center for healing dedicated to Rwandans could be one of the aspects. And I remember in our discussion with the professor a few days ago, he was mentioning of the fact that Canada has a responsibility, and as well, the international community, the UN, for having failed to stop the genocide in Rwanda. That is another discussion that could be had in another day, but setting up a center for healing would be in the interests of Canada, in the sense of having citizens coming in a country and succeeding would contribute to Canada's success. Maybe in my own case, I survived the genocide at a very young age. But as you move higher, people who survived the genocide when they were a bit older, say, my cousins who were teenagers at the time, the amount of impact that the genocide had on them was probably much more severe than it did to me. But then when they find themselves in Canada, then they face challenges in terms of their psychological well-being and in terms of them being able to succeed in the Canadian society. So a center for healing would be one of the contributions that Canada can give. The other aspect would be connected to the availing educational opportunities, having access to education. I know it sounds a little bit awkward, in Quebec you have free education, but in addition to you going to school, you have to survive, you have to live. So that would also be an aspect. In my own case, I was probably lucky. I benefited from merit-based scholarships, but for so many other young people who have the ability to go to school, they're not able to compete for scholarships. So that would be the other thing that Canada can do. One last thing that I think Canada can do would be in regard to, I know Canada has recognized all the genocides in one way or another, the Holocaust. I think probably the Armenian genocide is the one that hasn't been officially recognized. The Rwandan, it has been recognized. In the case of the Rwandan genocide, I know they term it as the Rwandan genocide as it is, but the correct term that is used under the UN, that was accepted under the UN, is the genocide against the Tutsi, so the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. And the rationale behind that is that it ensures that genocide deniers, or those who want to trivialize the genocide and say, oh, it wasn't really a genocide against a specific community, it was a genocide that was perpetuated against the Rwandan people. It's a little bit an insult to some of the survivors. To finish off with a very positive remark, even though there are those challenges existing in the Canadian society, I think Canada has done a good job in accepting Rwandan genocide survivors. Most of them, despite the fact that they're facing psychological issues or social issues, they're facing economic and social barriers. Canada has given them a home, a place to live, and Canada has welcomed them, A lot of them are Canadian citizens. Some of them had been stateless for so many years, so that's a good thing. And then now Canada needs to move on to do more, and I hope in one way or another I could contribute in finding out solutions. Thank you.
And our final speaker this afternoon, Dafina, Savic.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for including Roma in this conversation because we are, as I will try to explain, almost part of every issue and excluded from almost every conversation when it comes to human rights issues. So I really greatly appreciate the invitation. And as we say in Romanes, Roma people are the most persecuted group of people in Europe. And for those of you who are not familiar, Roma are commonly pejoratively referred to as quote-unquote gypsies. There are many variations of the term used in many different languages. In French, it would be gitan. In many Eastern European languages, you've already heard the term tsigan as well. And just to begin with the qualification of the term gypsy is essentially a term that was used by non-Roma people to identify Roma based on the mistaken belief that Roma came from Egypt, because when they arrived in Europe in the 11th century or so, originally coming from India, they were mistaken from coming from Egypt due to their darker skin and different languages. And the term has many pejorative connotations, as I will try to explain throughout my presentation. So the history of Roma is a very complex one, and it's very difficult to go through it in 12 minutes. So I've decided to more refocus the talk on the effects of the history of persecution of Roma in anti-Gypsyism today, and try to end with some recommendations about what can be done to address these issues. So as I mentioned, Roma originally come from India, came to Europe in the 12th century or so. And since their very existence, Roma have and continue to face ongoing violence, persecution, discrimination. Upon their arrival in Europe, they were sent to forced labor camps in Spain, for example. Roma, similarly to the presentations before me, were in fact were forced to change their names, were not allowed to speak their language, which is why it's a language that is endangered today, that many groups do not speak today because of reasons of persecution and discrimination. Roma were enslaved in what is today known as Romania for 500 years. And during the Holocaust, alongside with Jews, Roma were in fact part of the final solution. They were targeted as a group by the Nazis and their collaborators. During the Holocaust, in fact, between 500,000 up to 1 million Roma and Sinti were murdered in concentration camps, as well as in other forms by Nazis and their collaborators. Unfortunately, this history is very unknown or largely overlooked. In fact, the Canadian government still does not recognize, actually, the Roma genocide, despite the fact that our organization, along with the support of the Montreal Holocaust Museum, has actively tried to get this recognition of the Canadian government of the Roma genocide. And even in 2012, under the Conservative government at the time, there was actually a motion presented in Parliament, I believe that Mr. Erwin Cutler supported, that was actually denied. So there was actually a refusal to recognize the Roma genocide by the Canadian government. And the importance of recognizing history for Roma really speaks to the reason why Roma remain today one of the most marginalized and persecuted communities in Europe, but as well throughout the world. So Roma are not affiliated to a specific country. There are, in fact, diaspora that live throughout many countries. In Canada, there are about 80 to 100,000 Roma, which In fact, we often have a tendency to think of Roma as migrants or refugees because this notion often associated with Roma people is one of nomadism. And historically speaking, it's important to understand that Roma actually were faced with a forced nomadism because historically, as they came to Europe, they were often forced out of different countries, whether through anti-gypsy laws, through slavery, through forced labor camps, through persecution, as well as to the mass murder of Roma during the genocide. So Roma essentially kept moving until they found a place that was relatively safe and secure for them. Unfortunately, they never found that place, which is why we have many Roma groups across the world today in countries in Latin America, in the Middle East as well. There are actually subgroups of Roma in countries like Syria and Turkey, which were also affected by the Syrian crisis, but doubly so, in fact, because many Roma are actually rejected from refugee camps because of the discrimination of Roma. And this is something that is rarely part of the discourse when talking about refugees, generally speaking. As I mentioned, anti-Gypsying today is something that is very relevant in many ways and forms. For example, in countries like Hungary, and before I go on, I just want to maybe show the video, if it's possible. And just to give you a bit of context as this sets up, this is a video that was taken in Hungary, and it's actually not a video, it's a public campaign of the Jobbik party, which is one of the leading parties in Hungary. That's a neo-Nazi party. Was actually, a lot of their rhetoric was in fact an anti-Roma rhetoric, and this is a public campaign by this party, which is now the second most important party in Hungary, and I'll just show the video.
Egyre több törlesztő részletet kell fizetnünk. A bankoknak mindent szabad.
Míg dolgozunk, ezek csak lopnak. A politikus bűnözőknek mindent szabad.
Már félek kimenni az utcára. A cigány bűnözőknek mindent szabad?
Nincs magyar áru a polcon. A mótiknak mindent szabad.
Elegünk van az élősködésből. Ha önnek is, október 3-án szavazzon a Jobbikra.
So I don't know if you were able to read, so first those of you who weren't able to, essentially, this was a campaign to eradicate quote-unquote gypsy crime. And the campaign, as you saw, the fly at the end was supposed to represent a Roma, and the solution to eradicate crime was to kill the fly. And I think this notion also of dehumanization we have seen throughout genocides, I think namely in Rwanda, identifying the Tutsis as carcasses, during the Holocaust, Jews identified as vermins as well. So this is a form of dehumanization that is still present today. Like I said, this video was taken in 2011, and this party is actually still present in Europe, and we have seen a rise of neo-Nazi parties throughout Europe who've in fact built upon this anti-Roma rhetoric. There were actually in Hungary marches, anti-Roma marches organized throughout Roma villages where thousands of people, some of them dressed in costumes of Hitler carrying swastikas, were marching in the Roma villages chanting anti-Roma slogans. Out of that resulted many, many violent attacks, and 6 Roma, including a 6-year-old child, were in fact killed by such groups. This happened as well in countries such as Czech Republic, such as Slovakia, and yet this is shortly after. In order to try to escape this oppression and persecution, many Roma came to Canada as a sort of a last resort to try to escape this oppression and persecution as asylum seekers. Unfortunately, even in Canada, Roma have been faced with discrimination, as the Canadian government at the time, under Mr. Harper, the Minister of Immigration at the time was Mr. Jason Kenney, who publicly stated on various occasions that Roma were bogus refugees, undeserving of Canadian protection. And under Bill C-31, many countries, Hungary was probably one of the first countries placed on the safe country list, despite obvious instances of persecution and discrimination against the Roma community. And those were countries that were defined as safe countries being countries that normally do not produce refugees, where human rights are respected And I think that there were various organizations, like Amnesty International, the Council of Europe, the United Nations, even Harvard University published a very extensive study on the fact that Hungary was, and most of the countries on the list, in fact, were not safe for Roma communities because of the rise of neo-Nazism and ongoing persecution of these groups. And the Canadian government, in fact, went a step further in trying to block the entrance of Roma in Canada by, with taxpayer money, placing billboard campaigns in countries such as Hungary and Romania, where a lot of Roma were coming from, telling Roma essentially not to apply to Canada as asylum seekers because they will be swiftly denied. Unfortunately, the safe country list is still in place. This is something our organization has tried to get the government to eliminate. This is not to say that there have been changes since the Trudeau government has been in place, but unfortunately this is an issue that was not addressed. So this is an issue our organization has been trying to address. There are still unjust deportations. We worked with many families who were sent back to Hungary. There are still unjust deportations of Roma because of the effects of that laws. And recently, even under the current government, many Roma families were actually denied to board some flights from Hungary despite having visa and all the documentation required to enter the country simply because they were Roma. So that's a very clear instance of racial profiling against Roma communities. I don't know how much time I have. Okay, good. Essentially what we've seen is really the importance of the recognition, not only the recognition, but also the education about Roma history, which is rarely included, even within human rights circles. When we talk about the Holocaust, we rarely include the history of the Roma genocide, which happened during the Holocaust, and this is something our organization has been trying to advocate for, not only by the Canadian government, but more largely just simply including Roma as part of the conversation, because we have seen that this has a direct impact. And just to give you a bit of historical content about the Roma genocide, so it happened during the Holocaust, and August 2nd is the official date of commemoration of the Roma genocide, which we're asking the Canadian government to officially recognize. And this happened essentially in Auschwitz, because in Auschwitz-Birkenau there was a camp actually dedicated, specifically camp called the quote-unquote Gypsy Family Camp, where Roma men, women, and children were imprisoned, and there were about 23,000 Roma and Sinti who were at that camp in Auschwitz. Only 3,000 survived. And so on May 16th, the SS guards scheduled the extermination of all the members of that camp. And because Roma tried to resist, so they picked up the rocks or whatever was on the ground to try to resist, and they were able to extend their survival, but unfortunately only until August 2nd, where the SS guards actually ended up murdering all of the prisoners, the 2,867 remaining prisoners of that camp. So this day is now known as the day of the Roma genocide. And the importance of recognizing it is because we really see today across countries, as I mentioned, there are even recently Roma women who were forcefully sterilized in countries such as Slovakia, such as Hungary, such as the Czech Republic. Today, what we have modern segregation of Roma, where a lot of Roma live on the margins of society or live in ghettos, in schools in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Greece, in Serbia, throughout Europe. Roma children are placed in separate schools, so they are segregated in schools as well. In Hungary, often they are placed in special classes without prior testing, so Roma are assumed to be mentally inferior. So they are placed in classes where the school curriculum is inferior, and this also fuels this cycle of discrimination where Roma obviously have less opportunities. I think you mentioned about having the opportunities to access education. Well, often one of the stereotypes against the Roma communities is that they're less educated, but I mean, if we want Roma to be educated, we need to also let them go to school. I think that's one of the bases of education is being able to access it. And the other thing is we also forget that there also needs to be an education on the part of the people who are discriminating Roma because of reasons of lack of information of Roma history. And so I think I'm getting signs from here, so I'll stop it there. But just very quickly to end on a more positive note, there are concrete things that can be done. One of them, I don't know if on the screen we can see, but there's a petition that we have sent to Mr. Trudeau that you can sign, just asking for the official recognition of the Roma genocide to the Canadian government. The Montreal Holocaust Museum will be hosting, in partnership with Romanipe, a commemoration on August 2nd, which will be held in Montreal, so you're welcome to join it. And I think the other website shows us news and events where we have, so you can have all the information on our website. Just very quickly, one thing that really helps, which is very easy, is just getting informed. So we are active on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, just tweeting about it, liking our page, following our page. That's something that it's very easy to do. So get informed and share the information with other people. Don't wait for conferences, but also on daily conversations. Simply share the information. And lastly, show solidarity by attending the events that we organize, being present, tell your friends to attend. I think education and information is one of the easiest ways where we can counter racism and intolerance.
So thank you to all our speakers. We now have a few minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please go to one of the two microphones on either side of the room. I see nobody. I have a feeling, I know students, and I know students like talking to people one-on-one after conferences and are a bit too shy to go up to the microphone. Could you please go to the microphone because we can't hear you.
Has the current thank you very much for your 4 presentations. Has the current Russian government recognized the Holodomor?
Thank you. It always takes one brave soul to start the ball rolling, and after that we'll have an avalanche, I hope. Anyway, thank you for the question. No, the problem is that there was a, well, first of all, everything is concentrated on the famine, which is a wrong approach to genocide, Ukrainian genocide. There was famine across the Soviet Union, in Kazakhstan, along the Volga, in Northern Caucasus, and in Ukraine. It must be remembered that much of the population that was in those famine regions were not ethnic Russians. For example, Northern Caucasus, Kuban, it was about 2/3 Ukrainian. And the Ukrainians were persecuted, especially they were deported. Now, the Russian government has recognized that there was a famine in the Soviet Union, and even recognizes some responsibility of the government on it. But it never recognized the Holodomor in the sense of genocide in Ukraine. Another problem is that each genocide has to be studied separately. Of course, we have comparative genocidal studies. We have to compare and so on, what they have in common, but each genocide is decided on its own. Not to say, well, they suffered similarly, and there wasn't genocide, so there isn't genocide in the other. No, each has to be said. I don't know if this answers your question, but this is the problem at this point.
Thank you. I see no other questions. Oh.
Yeah, no, if no one is asking a question, I'll ask a second question because I think people should ask questions. I wish somebody else would ask them too. I'm going to ask a second question. Thank you very much, Mr. Attarian, for your wonderful presentation on the Armenian genocide and also for your reading I believe it's your poem. And I just wanted to ask, what does your community believe it will take for the current government of Turkey to recognize what was done by the Ottoman Empire? And I'm sure that there are a lot of, and have the United Nations General Assembly recognize the Armenian genocide?
Well, thank you for the question. The actions of the current government of Turkey, I think, speak for themselves. The current government of Turkey is very, 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 very far from even respecting human rights in its own country. We have parliamentary immunity taken away from members of parliament. We have members of oppositions being jailed. The HDP, the Kurdish opposition party, the two leaders are jailed, and the government is asking for 142 years of jail term for them. So the government is actually not interested. However, I have to say that there are cracks in the wall. The cracks in the wall have started to appear over the past 10 years, where more and more people are talking. People are thinking, yes, you know, our grandfathers told us things about that. Yes, you know, my grandmother was Armenian. She was one of the Islamicized orphans with whom I talked about in my poem. There's Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist, who one of the sub-themes of his main novel was about the genocide of Armenians. So, in fact, there are conferences have taken place, conferences such as this one, where students and, you know, academics have come together and even started using the G word. However, the government is very far from it, because the Turkish state is, in fact, a continuation of the what we call the Ittihad ve Terakki, which is the political party, with the ultranationalist political party that believed in Turkish racial purity and so on, all the things that you know about that lead to genocide. The Kemalist government is essentially a continuation of those policies. And the current Republic of Turkey is foundationally the Kemalist government of the 1920s and 30s. These include all kinds of things, such as laws, you know, passed saying, okay, the people who were murdered, they are not returning, therefore all their lands are abandoned, therefore the state takes them. The people who are murdered, they have no descendants because all their descendants are also murdered. Therefore, their insurance policies, payments belong to the state of Turkey. So, I mean, again, these kinds of actions on a continuous basis over a period of decades have shown that the state of Turkey is actually not interested. There's education that needs to be done. There's dialogue that needs to be done. And I believe, you know, the time will come that the truth will prevail. Going back to the next question, yes, in the United Nations, there was a report of Benjamin Whitaker back in the 80s, where it studied the case histories, saying what are things that constitute genocides, and one of them is the Armenian genocide, is in the Whitaker report, which is a subcommittee on human rights issues and crimes against humanity. So the Armenian genocide is listed there. But I don't think the United Nations as General Assembly votes on what is a genocide or not.
Thank you. I believe our time is up, and I don't see any more questions. So I would like to thank all of our speakers, and thank you everybody for coming. And I don't know if Marlene, there is anything to say about the next thing, because I don't know what's happening next. Okay, so there's a 5-minute health break. Thanks again, everybody, and thank you to our speakers. It was very good. Thanks a lot.